I drove to my son's housewarming party wearing the finest suit I owned. The moment I stepped into a living room packed with wealthy guests, I heard my daughter-in-law smirk and whisper to her mother, "Oh, look, I can't believe they invited the yard man." A few people chuckled under their breath. My throat tightened. I turned to leave, but my son suddenly grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Dad, please don't go. Just tonight. I've been waiting 2 years for this moment." 1 hour later, the first scream echoed from upstairs. "I'm so grateful you chose to spend this time with me." Drop a comment below and let me know which country or city are you joining from. It means the world to see where these stories travel. Just a heads up, certain elements here were crafted for narrative and educational value. Names and settings are fictional, but the heart behind every word that was never made up. I want to tell you about the night I walked into my son's house wearing the best suit I owned and left knowing I had already won. But that part comes later. First, let me tell you about the moment I almost didn't stay. It was a Saturday evening in early November, and I had driven 40 minutes south from Conroe, down Highway 45, into Houston, into the kind of neighborhood where the houses sit back from the street, like they're too good to be seen clearly. River Oaks, the kind of zip code that gets mentioned in the same breath as old money and older attitudes. I pulled my truck into the circular driveway and parked between a silver Mercedes and something low and Italian-looking that I couldn't name and didn't try to. I sat in the cab for a moment, checked my collar in the rearview mirror, smoothed the lapel of my navy suit, the one I had worn to my own wedding 39 years ago, the one Sandra always said made me look like a man worth knowing. I had it dry cleaned the week before, pressed the shirt myself that morning, polished my boots until they caught the light from the street lamp. I was 68 years old, and I had spent the better part of those years learning that dignity is not something other people give you. It's something you carry in yourself, regardless of the room you're walking into. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Victoria answered it herself. She was in a red dress hair, up the kind of effortless perfection that takes a full team and 3 hours to construct. She looked at me with a smile that stayed exactly where it was and said, "Harold, you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. She stepped aside to let me in, and I crossed the threshold into a room full of people I had never met. Soft jazz, coming from somewhere, the smell of expensive flowers and catered food. 60, maybe 65 people filling the space, all dressed in the language of money, the kind of casual that costs more than formal. I was scanning the room for Ethan when I heard it. It came from my left, maybe 8 feet away, where Victoria had drifted back toward her mother, and a cluster of women in silk and pearls. Her voice was low conversational, the way you'd comment on the weather to someone standing next to you at a bus stop. "Oh, look," she said, and there was the lightest curl of amusement in it. "I didn't know they were letting the yard man in now." A sound moved through the small group. Not quite laughter. Something closer to the exhale of people who found something funny, but had enough social instinct not to commit to it fully. A woman glanced away quickly. Another lifted her champagne glass to her lips at a very convenient moment. Claire Hayes, Victoria's mother, wearing a pale gold dress and a smile so thin you could read a newspaper through it, looked off toward the far wall, as if something fascinating had appeared there. I stood in the middle of that lobby with my polished boots and my wedding suit, and my 68 years, and I felt something drop through the floor of my chest. I knew that feeling. I had felt it before a long time ago, that specific gravity of being made small in front of people, the way shame doesn't ask your age or your history before it sits down on your shoulders. My throat locked up. My jaw tightened. My hands, with their 40 years of calluses and cracked knuckles and honest work, curled at my sides. One foot turned toward the door. Not as a decision, as a reflex. Then Ethan was there. He appeared out of the crowd the way he used to appear when he was a little boy, and something had gone wrong, fast, quiet, purposeful. He stepped close, one hand finding my arm just above the elbow, and he leaned in toward my ear. "Don't, Dad," he said low and steady. "I need you to stay. Trust me. Just tonight." I turned to look at him. His jaw was set. His eyes were something I had never quite seen on my son's face before. Not fear, not desperation, but a kind of locked-in calm that made the back of my neck prickle. "Ethan," I said quietly, "what is going on?" "Not yet," he said. "Just stay, please." He gave my arm one firm squeeze, held my eyes for another second, and then he was gone back into the crowd, moving toward the far side of the room, with the practiced ease of a man who needed to be somewhere specific without anyone noticing. I stood there, heart still hammering, the room still moving around me like nothing had happened, because for most of these people, nothing had. I made myself breathe. I made myself walk not toward the door, but toward the far table where a handful of people I didn't recognize were standing with plates of food and the comfortable posture of people who belong to the working world, not the performing one. I found out later they were engineers, colleagues of Ethan's. They asked me about Conroe. They asked about the land. They talked to me like a man worth talking to, and I was grateful for every ordinary word. But part of me, the part that had been standing in that lobby, with my foot already turning toward the door, stayed very, very alert. I watched Victoria work the room like it was choreographed. The laugh at exactly the right volume. The hand on an arm at exactly the right moment. She was extraordinary at it, I'll give her that. Across the room, Preston Hayes, her father, moved through clusters of guests with the chest-forward confidence of a man who believed every room he entered was improved by his presence. He was somewhere in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of tan you get from actual leisure rather than actual labor. And every few minutes, Ethan would catch my eye from across the room. Just a glance, just long enough to say, "Not yet." I ate. I talked to the engineers. I watched the clock on my phone without looking like I was watching the clock. And then, about an hour and 40 minutes into the evening, Victoria picked up the small microphone the caterer had set up near the fireplace, tapped it twice, and smiled at the room. "Before the evening wraps up," she said in the warm, practiced tone of someone who had made many toasts and enjoyed every one of them, "we have a little surprise for everyone." She looked toward Ethan across the room, and in her eyes there was something that I can only describe as the expression of a person who believes they have already won. She had no idea. 1 hour after I almost walked out that door, Victoria Hayes began to understand what my son had meant when he said, "Trust me, just tonight." And she was the one doing the screaming. But before I take you inside that room and show you what happened next, you need to know who I am. Because Victoria Hayes had already decided the moment I walked through that door in my Navy suit and my polished boots that she knew exactly who I was. A yard man. An old laborer who had wandered into the wrong party. She was wrong about every single thing. My name is Harold Miller. I am 68 years old, and I was born in Montgomery County, Texas, in a house my father built with his own hands on a piece of land he bought in 1971 with 15 years of saved wages. My father, James Miller, was a pipe fitter from Georgia who came to Texas for the oil fields and stayed for the soil. He used to say, "Son, land doesn't lie to you. It gives back exactly what you put in." My father was not a complicated man, but he understood complicated things. I grew up on those 45 acres outside of Conroe, where the pine trees take over the landscape, and the roads get narrow, and the houses are spaced far enough apart that you can still hear yourself think. I followed my father into the fields at 16, not because I had no other options, but because I understood what he was building, and I wanted to be part of it. I didn't go to college. I went to work. For 34 years, I ran a landscaping and grounds maintenance company out of the back of a truck that became 2 trucks and eventually a small crew. We serviced the neighborhoods that people like the Hayes family lived in River Oaks Tanglewood Memorial. I knew every variety of oak and magnolia in those yards. I knew which soil drained well and which held water. I built things that lasted. I fixed things that were broken. And at the end of every day, I drove back north on Highway 45 to Conroe, to my 45 acres, to the house where Sandra was waiting. "Sandra, Harold," she said to me once sitting on the back porch on a September evening with a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. "People are going to underestimate you your whole life. Let them. It keeps them off balance." She was a fifth-grade teacher at an elementary school in Conroe. Quiet, steady, with a sharpness to her that she kept folded up most of the time, the kind of sharp that only came out when it was needed. She could read a person in 5 minutes and be right about them for the next 20 years. She taught me how to pay attention to the right things. We had Ethan in 1989. Watching that boy grow up was the great privilege of my life. He was curious about everything, followed me around the property, asking questions I didn't always have answers to, which I told him was the sign of a good mind. He earned a full scholarship to the University of Texas at Austin, studied civil engineering, and graduated at the top of his program. The day I watched him walk across that stage in Austin, I had to look away from the crowd for a minute, because my eyes were doing something embarrassing. Sandra squeezed my hand so hard that afternoon that I felt it for 3 days. 3 years ago, she got sick. Breast cancer, fast and aggressive, the kind that doesn't give you time to argue with it. She was gone in 7 months. I sat beside her in that hospital room in Conroe and held her hand while she looked at me with those eyes of hers, still sharp, still steady, even at the end, and said, "You raised that boy right, Harold. Don't you dare fall apart on him now." I told her I wouldn't. She died on a Thursday morning in March of 2021. I kept my word. I didn't fall apart. But I won't pretend the farm didn't feel different after that. Quieter in the wrong ways. The back porch without her voice on it. The kitchen in the morning without the sound of her moving around. 45 acres that had always felt full suddenly had a lot of empty in them. Ethan drove out every weekend for 6 months after she passed. We'd work the property together in the mornings, clearing brush, fixing fence line, arguing about the pecan trees that never produced the way I wanted them to. We'd eat lunch on the back porch, same 2 chairs Sandra and I had always used, and we'd talk until the sun got low. Those were hard months. But they were good months, too, in the way that grief sometimes gives you back the people you still have. Then, in the summer of 2022, Ethan brought someone home. He called me on a Thursday evening, voice lighter than it had been in a while, and said, "Dad, I've been seeing someone. Her name is Victoria. I'd like you to meet her." "Bring her Sunday," I said. She comes from a different kind of background," Ethan said, and I remember thinking that is a strange thing to lead with. "Sunday is Sunday," I told him. "Dinner's at 6. He said okay. And then before he hung up, he said something I have thought about many times since. "Dad, she's very good at first impressions." I didn't know what to do with that. So I said, "That's fine, son," and I went back to what I was doing. Standing now in that River Oaks living room, watching the woman in the red dress smile at 60 strangers, I understood finally what Ethan had meant. Not as a compliment. As a warning that he hadn't known at the time how to give, but there was something Sandra had written down, in those careful small letters of hers, in a notebook I wouldn't find until much later. Something she had known long before any of us did. Something that changed everything once I read it. And I came very close to never finding it at all. The sharpest thing about Sandra was that she was almost never wrong about people. The problem was she never got the chance to meet Victoria Hayes. On a Sunday evening in late August of 2022, Ethan pulled up the gravel driveway in his truck, with Victoria in the passenger seat, and I stood on the front porch watching them climb out. My chest did something warm and complicated my son home for Sunday dinner, bringing someone new, someone who made his voice sound lighter on the phone. I wanted to like her. I had already decided to try. She stepped out of the truck and smiled up at me, and I will say this, the woman knew how to make an entrance. Silk blouse, tailored slacks, a bottle of red wine cradled in one arm, and a small bouquet of sunflowers in the other. Sunflowers. Sandra's favorite. "Mr. Miller," she said, climbing the porch steps with her hand extended. "I have heard so much about you. This property is absolutely stunning." "It's home," I said and shook her hand. "Call me Harold." "Harold." She smiled wider. "I love that name. Strong name." Ethan grinned behind her like a man who had just won something, and I thought, all right. Let's see. Dinner went smoothly enough on the surface. Victoria complimented the food, twice asked about the pecan trees with what sounded like genuine curiosity, and laughed at the right moments in conversation. But Sandra had taught me a long time ago to watch the eyes. Smiles can be rehearsed. Eyes take more effort to lie with. Victoria's eyes when they moved around my kitchen, the old pegboard where I hang my tools, the work boots by the back door, the faded curtains Sandra had picked out 20 years ago, did something I recognized but couldn't immediately name. It was a kind of cataloging, quiet, quick, thorough, the way an assessor looks at a property. After dinner, Ethan pushed back from the table and said, "Dad, I was thinking maybe this spring we do something with the south field. Put in a proper irrigation line." Before I could answer, Victoria set down her wine glass and said pleasantly, "Ethan mentioned the property is quite large. 45 acres, is that right, Harold?" 45.5, I said, give or take. "And you've had it how long, your whole life?" "My father bought it in 71, I said. "I grew up on it." "That's remarkable." She tilted her head and the smile stayed perfectly calibrated. "Land like this out here, it must be worth quite a bit these days. Have you ever thought about what you'd do with it eventually?" My fork stopped halfway to my plate. Ethan shifted in his chair. "I plan to be buried on it," I said. Victoria laughed, bright and musical. Of course, of course. I only meant for Ethan's sake down the line, planning ahead." I looked at my son. He was looking at his plate. Something moved through his face too fast for me to catch it. I told myself I was being a protective father. I cut another piece of chicken and let it go. 3 months later, Ethan told me Victoria's family wanted to have us over for dinner. Her parents lived in the Woodlands 30 minutes south of me, a planned community of manicured streets and homes that announced their price tag from the curb. I wore my good flannel shirt and pressed slacks, which I later understood was approximately the equivalent of showing up to a black tie event in pajamas as far as Claire Hayes was concerned. Preston Hayes answered the door. He was a tall man, silver-haired with the permanent tan of someone whose leisure was a full-time occupation. He shook my hand the way you shake something you are legally required to touch, but would prefer not to. Firm, brief, released. "Harold," he said, "Victoria talks about you." "Good things, I hope," I said. He smiled and didn't answer, which was itself a kind of answer. Claire Hayes appeared from the interior of the house in a cream blouse and the expression of composed hospitality that I recognized immediately as performance. She kissed both of Victoria's cheeks, hugged Ethan warmly, and then turned to me with a smile so precisely constructed it had probably been practiced in a mirror. "Harold," she said, "what a treat. Ethan tells us you're in landscaping. Grounds maintenance mostly." "Oh," I said, 40 years of it." "How pastoral," she said, and reached out to touch my arm for exactly 1 second before moving into the house. I didn't know the word. I looked it up when I got home. It means charmingly rural. It also, depending on tone, means quaint in a way that reveals your limitations. Claire Hayes had intended the second definition. I confirmed this when I sat with it long enough. Dinner at the Hayes house was a production. 4 courses of wine pairing a table set with china I was afraid to breathe on. Preston spent most of the meal talking about his company Hayes Capital Properties commercial real estate across southeast Texas in the way that men talk about money, when they want you to understand the distance between you and them. Then over dessert, he set down his fork and looked at me directly for the first time all evening. Harold, I have to ask, a corridor like yours north of Conroe that's becoming very interesting territory for development. Have you had much interest from buyers over the years? My chest went tight in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Some, I said carefully. I don't entertain it. Smart man. He nodded, swirling his wine. Hold your position. That's always the right move until the right moment. He winked at Ethan. Ethan smiled back, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and his hand on the table curled slowly into a fist under the edge of the tablecloth. I noticed. I filed it away. I told myself it was nothing. I drove home that night with the windows down, the November air cold and sharp off the pine trees, and I sat with the feeling that had been following me all evening. Like I'd just attended a meeting where the agenda was kept secret from me. Like the pleasantries had been a warm-up for something else entirely. I talked myself out of it by the time I reached the Conroe city limits. These were successful people with big personalities, I told myself. Preston was a real estate man. Of course, he asked about land. That was like asking a mechanic about cars. I talked myself out of it for the next 19 months. And then March came, and Ethan stopped calling the way he used to, and something that had been quietly wrong began to make itself known. There is a kind of cruelty that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come through the door loud and obvious the way you'd expect cruelty to come. It works slowly, the way water finds cracks in stone, patient and invisible, and by the time you feel the full damage, the structure is already compromised deep where you can't see it. That's what the spring and summer of 2024 felt like. A slow erasure. It started small. Ethan had always called me on Sunday evenings, not religiously, not by agreement, just by habit, the way good habits form between people who genuinely like each other's company. In March of 2024, those calls started running shorter. 10 minutes instead of 30. Answers that were technically complete but somehow hollow, like he was reading from an approved script. "You doing okay, son?" I asked one Sunday in late March. "Yeah, Dad. Busy week. You know how it gets. You sound tired." "I'm fine." A pause that lasted a beat too long. "Victoria says hi." She had never once in 2 years asked Ethan to say hello to me unprompted. My stomach dropped clean through the floor of my chest, but I said, "Tell her hi back." And we talked for 3 more minutes about nothing, and then he was gone. By April, the Sunday dinners we'd fallen into a loose rhythm of sometimes at the farm, sometimes at a restaurant halfway between Conroe and Houston, started getting canceled. Always with a reason. Victoria wasn't feeling well. They had guests coming in from out of town. Ethan had a deadline that snuck up on him. "Of course," I said every single time. "Don't worry about it. We'll do it another week." I meant it. That was the thing that made it so effective. Every individual excuse was believable. It was only the pattern that told the truth, and patterns take time to see. I tried driving down to Houston one Saturday morning in May, unannounced, the way I used to when Ethan lived closer, and we'd grab breakfast at the diner on Shepherd before the weekend crowds hit. I rang the doorbell of the River Oaks house, and Victoria answered in a silk robe, coffee in hand, looking at me with an expression of pleasant surprise so immaculate it must have taken years to develop. "Harold," she said, her voice warm as a gas fireplace. "What a nice surprise. Come in, come in." She stepped back, and I walked into the kitchen, which smelled like fresh coffee and something baked, and she poured me a cup without being asked, and set it on the counter with a smile that showed every tooth. "Ethan's actually on a work call right now," she said. "One of those terrible early Saturday things. You know how demanding his clients are." "Sure," I said. "I can wait." Of course, of course." She settled onto a bar stool across from me, crossing her ankles, utterly relaxed. "So how's the property still keeping you busy?" We talked for 45 minutes about nothing, the weather, the pecan trees, a landscaping project I was doing on the north fence line. Victoria was charming, engaged, asked follow-up questions at exactly the right moments. And the whole time from somewhere down the hall, I could hear Ethan's voice, easy, unhurried, not the voice of a man in a high-pressure work call, the voice of a man talking to a friend. When Ethan finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, he looked at me and something crossed his face so fast, it was gone before I could name it. Guilt. Relief. Fear. Some terrible mixture of all three. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Hey, I didn't know you were coming. Thought I'd surprise you," I said, watching his face. He crossed the kitchen and hugged me. And over his shoulder I saw Victoria watching us with that small, composed smile of hers, and something in my chest pulled tight like a rope being tested. We sat at the kitchen table for another hour. Ethan talked about work. I talked about the farm. Victoria refreshed everyone's coffee and made a comment here and there and was by every measurable standard a perfect hostess. But Ethan's eyes kept sliding sideways, not to her exactly, but aware of her the way you're aware of a door that isn't quite latched, always half expecting it to swing open. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the cab of my truck, in my own driveway, for a long time, engine off, listening to the pines in the wind. "Sandra," I said out loud, to the empty seat beside me, because I had started doing that since she passed, just talking to where she would have been. "Something is wrong with our boy." The pines moved. The wind didn't answer. By July, Ethan had canceled 4 consecutive attempts to get together. His texts came back fast, too fast, like they were ready before I finished sending, and the excuses had started cycling. I began writing them down in a notepad I kept by the kitchen phone, not because I planned to use them, but because I needed to see the pattern written out in front of me to trust that I wasn't imagining it. June 2nd, Victoria has a migraine. June 15th, work emergency, can't get away. June 29th. They have friends visiting from Dallas. July 13th, Ethan says he'll call later. He doesn't call. I stared at that list on a Tuesday night in late July, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, and my heart ached with a grief that felt different from losing Sandra, smaller maybe, but sharper, because this loss was still moving, still choosing day by day to leave. I didn't know it then. But that same week in an office I had never been to, someone pressed a notary stamp onto a document that carried my name at the bottom of a signature line. My name. My signature. Except I had never once touched that page. It was a Tuesday morning in August when I finally opened the last box. I had been avoiding it for 3 years. Not consciously, not the way you avoid something you're afraid of, more the way you leave a light on in a room you're not ready to walk into yet. Sandra had packed that box herself in the fall of 2020, before the illness got bad enough to take the strength from her hands. She had taped it closed with the brown packing tape she always kept in the utility drawer, written her own name on the top in black marker, and set it in the corner of the bedroom closet. And there it had sat through 3 Texas summers and 3 Texas winters, while I walked around it every morning getting dressed and told myself I'd get to it eventually. That Tuesday I got to it. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down and stood there for a moment with my hands on top of it and my heart already doing something complicated in my chest. Then I got a cup of coffee, sat down, and opened it. Clothes, mostly. A cardigan she loved, pale yellow, that still held the shape of her shoulders in a way that made my eyes burn. A small jewelry box. 2 framed photographs I hadn't seen since before she got sick, one of us at the Grand Canyon in 1998. One of Ethan on his first day of kindergarten, grinning so hard, his face looked like it might split open. I set those aside carefully. Then, at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth Sandra had cut from an old kitchen curtain, was a notebook. Green cover, spiral-bound, the same kind she'd always used for grocery lists and lesson plans, and the thoughts she didn't want to lose. I unwrapped it slowly. The first few pages were ordinary. A recipe for peach cobbler, a list of plants she wanted to put in the front bed in the spring, a note to call the dentist. Then I turned to a page dated October 14th, 2020, and everything changed. Sandra's handwriting was smaller than usual on this page. Careful. Like she was trying to fit something important into a space that felt insufficient. Talked to Beverly Marsh today. She's been on the Montgomery County Planning Commission for 6 years. You remember Beverly Harold from the school board. She told me something she probably shouldn't have. There's a highway expansion project in early planning stages, a new corridor running north from the 249 through the land between Conroe and Magnolia. She says the exact route isn't public yet, but the preliminary maps include our area. She said, and I'm writing this exactly, Sandra land in that corridor is going to be worth something nobody's talking about yet. I put the notebook down, picked up my coffee, set it back down without drinking it. My hands were trembling, not a lot, just enough that I noticed, just enough that the notebook shook slightly when I picked it up again. I don't know when this goes public or how long it takes. But I know Harold. He would sell too fast, too cheap to the wrong person, because that's what good men do when they're pressured and they don't know the full picture. So I'm writing this down so there's a record. So he knows. So nobody can take this from our family. And at the bottom of the page, underlined 3 times in letters larger than anything else on the page, Harold must not sell. Not to anyone, not for any price. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The August heat pressed against the windows. Outside, a mockingbird was arguing with something in the pecan trees. The coffee went completely cold beside me. Sandra, I said out loud to the empty kitchen, to the yellow cardigan still sitting on the table. How did you know? But I knew how she knew. She had always known. 20 years of watching people walk through our lives, reading them in 5 minutes, filing away the truth of them, while I was still shaking hands and giving benefit of the doubt. She had known something would come eventually, some pressure on the land, some person or circumstance that would test whether Harold would hold. She had written the warning before the threat had a name. That was enough. She had read the danger in all of it, and she had done the only thing she could do. She had left me a map. I turned to the next page. She had written down Beverly Marsh's phone number, the name of the planning document, Montgomery County Thoroughfare Plan 2021, revision and a note. Check the county assessor's records for comparable sales along the 249 corridor. The numbers will tell you what the project is worth. I closed the notebook and pressed my hand flat on the cover for a moment, like I was steadying something. Then I got up, went to the drawer where I keep the notepad by the kitchen phone, and flipped back 3 weeks to a name and number I had written down after a conversation shown with Daniel Reeves, my property lawyer, a man I had used for a land transaction 15 years back and trusted completely. I had called Daniel in July just to ask a general question about what rights I had if someone were to try to make changes to my property without my knowledge. Daniel had answered the question and then said quietly, "Harold, if you ever need someone who specializes in situations like this, the kind that haven't become legal problems yet, but might, there's a man I've worked with for years. Marcus Webb. He's a private investigator out of Houston. Good man, thorough. Knows property fraud cases inside out." I had written the number down. I hadn't called it. I called it now. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice, flat and unhurried, said, "Webb Investigations." "My name is Harold Miller," I said. "I need to talk to someone about protecting my land." A pause. Then, "When can you come in?" Marcus Webb's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Westheimer Road in Houston that looked like it had last been renovated sometime during the Reagan administration. The elevator was slow. The carpet in the hallway was the color of old mustard, and the frosted glass door at the end of the hall said Webb. Investigations, private and confidential, in plain black letters with no flourish whatsoever. I knocked. A voice said, "It's open." Marcus Webb was sitting behind a desk that was buried under organized stacks of folders. a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Fisherman" on the side, and two monitors showing what looked like financial spreadsheets. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, built like a man who had done physical work before he did desk work, with a face that carried the particular expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by other human beings a long time ago. He stood up when I came in, shook my hand, a real handshake, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Harold Miller," he said, settling back into his chair. "Daniel Reeves called me. Said you might be coming in. Sit down, tell me everything, and don't worry about what sounds crazy. In this business, the crazy-sounding ones are usually the ones that are real." So I told him everything. I started with the Sunday dinner in August of 2022. The way Victoria's eyes had moved around my kitchen, like she was appraising it. I told him about Preston Hayes at the Woodlands, the handshake that wasn't a handshake, the questions about the land that came too fast and too specific for a man I'd just met. I told him about the 19 months of erosion, the canceled dinners, the shortened calls, the Saturday morning visit, where Ethan had looked at me like a man trying to say something, his mouth wouldn't form. I took Sandra's notebook out of my jacket pocket and set it on the desk. Marcus picked it up. He read slowly, turned the pages, carefully, didn't rush. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me with those flat, steady eyes. "You said you didn't sign any documents recently," he asked. "Nothing," I said. "Not for years. Last thing I signed was an equipment lease in 2019. Anyone have access to your personal information, social security number, date of birth, property, deed records." I felt my stomach tighten. "Those things are... the deed is public record. Anyone could find it." "They could," Marcus said. "And someone like Preston Hayes with 20 years in commercial real estate and the right connections at the county level would know exactly where to look and what to do with what he found." He leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk. "Harold, I want to be straight with you, because Daniel tells me you're a straight-talking man. What you're describing, the pattern of isolation, the questions about the property, the timeline, this has a shape I've seen before. I've worked 15 cases in the last 10 years that started exactly this way. Family member married into a property-holding household begins systematically cutting the asset holder off from their support network, creates legal or financial pressure to transfer or encumber the asset. It's not complicated. It's just patient." The air in that office felt suddenly very thin. My chest tightened so hard it was almost painful. "My son," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "Ethan, he's not part of this. I know my son." "I believe you," Marcus said, and the directness of it steadied me. "But I need to find out what leverage they have over him. Because a man who loves his father doesn't disappear for 19 months without a reason that feels bigger than himself." He paused. "You mentioned his career. Tell me about his work." I told him about Ethan's engineering firm, the projects he ran, the reputation he had built over 8 years. Marcus listened and typed notes without looking at the keyboard. "Okay," he said finally. "Here's what I can do, and here's what you need to know about how I do it." He reached into his desk drawer and produced a small digital recorder, barely larger than a pack of gum, and set it on the desk between us. In the state of Texas, recording a conversation is legal as long as one party in that conversation consents. That party can be you. You don't need Victoria's permission, Preston's permission, or anybody else's. If you are present in the conversation, you can record it. Every word they say to you, every question they ask about that land, every comment about your son, all of it becomes evidence. I looked at the recorder. Something shifted in my chest, not rage, not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling of a window opening in a room that had been locked shut for too long. "What about what you find?" I asked. "How do you find it legally?" "Public records, property filings, business registrations, court records, all of it is legally accessible," Marcus said. I can also conduct surveillance in public spaces. I don't go into private property. I don't access private accounts. I don't do anything that would make what we find inadmissible or land either of us in trouble. We do this right, Harold, or we don't do it at all." He picked up the recorder and held it toward me. "I'd also strongly recommend you talk to Daniel Reeves about a revocable living trust. It's a legal structure that puts your property inside a protected framework. It means nobody can sell, transfer, or encumber that land while you're alive without your direct witnessed, notarized consent. Victoria Hayes could have power of attorney signed by the Pope himself, and it wouldn't touch a properly structured trust." I reached out and took the recorder. It was lighter than I expected. "How much?" I asked. Marcus named a number. It was significant. I didn't flinch. "One more question," I said, turning the recorder over in my fingers. "Why does a man who spent 25 years doing this still care about winning?" Marcus Webb looked at me for a moment, and something moved briefly in those flat eyes, something that might have been a memory. "Because I had a father too," he said. "And someone tried to do something similar to him. Didn't go well." He picked up his coffee mug. "We're going to go through everything they've got. And then we're going to let the truth do what it does. Agreed." I put the recorder in my shirt pocket right over my heart and said, "Agreed." I drove home to Conroe that evening with the recorder warm against my chest, and something else Marcus had said turning over and over in my mind, something about Ethan, about leverage, about a reason that feels bigger than himself. I didn't have that peace yet, but something told me it was coming. And when it arrived, it was going to change every assumption I had made about the last 19 months. 3 days after I drove home from Marcus Webb's office with that recorder in my shirt pocket, Ethan showed up at the farm. No call ahead, no text. Just his truck coming up the gravel driveway at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, dust lifting behind it in the September heat, and my son climbing out, looking like a man who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that his body had started to curve around the weight of it. I was on the back porch replacing a hinge on the screen door when I heard the truck. I set down my screwdriver and walked around the side of the house, and when Ethan saw me, something in his face just broke open. Not crying, not yet, but the expression of a man whose control over his own face had finally reached its limit. "Victoria's at her mother's," he said without me asking. "She'll be gone until 7. I've got a few hours." "Then come sit down," I said. "I'll get us some tea." We settled into the 2 chairs on the back porch, the same chairs Sandra and I had shared for 30 years. And for a moment, Ethan just looked out at the property. The September light was doing what it does in Texas at that hour, turning everything gold and slightly unreal. The pecan trees threw long shadows across the south field. I let him look. I knew he was finding the words, and I knew from 40 years of raising him that the best thing I could do was not fill the space before he was ready. "Dad," he said finally, his voice rough at the edges. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" "I'm not going anywhere, son," I said. He nodded, wrapped both hands around his glass of iced tea, and began. In 2019, Ethan was leading a structural engineering team on a commercial development project in Galveston, a mid-size retail complex near the seawall. He was 30 years old, running his first major independent project, trying to prove himself to a firm that had taken a chance on him. Somewhere in the foundation load calculations, a set of numbers he had checked twice, but not a third time because he was exhausted and overconfident in the way that young engineers sometimes are. There was an error, not catastrophic. The foundation settled unevenly during early construction, causing stress fractures in 2 support columns. Nobody was hurt. The site was evacuated the moment the issue was detected. The project was halted. The insurance company was brought in, the damage was assessed and corrected. The engineering firm handled it internally. Ethan cooperated fully, submitted a corrected report, and was formally counseled but not terminated. The matter was closed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my chest had gone tight as a drum. Ethan looked at me and his eyes were wet at the corners. "Because I was ashamed, Dad. Because you'd worked your whole life doing things right the first time and I couldn't. I couldn't look at you and say I'd cut a corner. Even once. Even a small one. Ethan." My voice came out thick. "Son, that would never have changed a single thing about how I see you." He pressed his lips together hard, fighting something back. "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it then." He took a breath and kept going. Victoria had found the original engineering report, the one with the error documented with Ethan's signature on the bottom 18 months into their relationship. He never found out exactly how. His best guess was that she had gone through his files while he was traveling for work, found the folder he had kept as a reminder to himself, a private record of the worst professional moment of his life. She hadn't confronted him right away. She had held it for 3 months before she used it. She brought it out one night after dinner. Ethan said, his jaw working. Very calm, like she was just making conversation. She said, "I came across some old paperwork of yours. The Galveston project. That must have been a difficult time." And I knew I could see it in her face that the calm was the threat, that the real message was underneath the words. "What did she say exactly?" I asked, leaning forward. "She said, I would never want something like that to resurface and cause problems for you, especially now that your career is going so well." And then she smiled and asked if I wanted more coffee. Ethan's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles went pale. "Dad, the Texas Board of Professional Engineers, if a formal complaint is filed with new allegations attached, they have to investigate. Even if the original matter was resolved. If she framed it as deliberate concealment, as me knowingly signing off on a compromised structure, even if none of that is true, I could lose my license, my entire career, everything I built." My heart hurt for him in a way I hadn't felt since I sat beside Sandra in that hospital room. This was my boy, my brilliant, hard-working, scholarship-earning boy, and he had been trapped in a cage made of one moment of human error, held there by a woman who had calculated exactly how much fear that cage could generate. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He blinked hard twice, forcing his eyes clear. "Since February," he said, "of this year. 7 months. 7 months of canceled dinners and shortened phone calls and that terrible look on his face the Saturday I came to the house, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, like a man surfacing from something he couldn't name. She told me to stay away from you," Ethan said, and the words came out like something being dragged out of him. She said you'd just make things more complicated, that you didn't understand how her family operated, and that if I tried to involve you, things would get worse." He finally looked at me, eyes, red-rimmed voice breaking at the seams. "Dad, I am so sorry. I kept thinking I could fix it myself. I kept thinking I could find a way out that didn't blow everything up. And then I ran out of time and I ran out of ideas, and I didn't know what else to do." I stood up from my chair, crossed the 2 feet of porch between us, and put my hand on the back of my son's neck, the way I used to when he was small, and something had gone wrong at school. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead into his hands, and his shoulders shook once hard like something giving way. "Look at me," I said. He lifted his head. His eyes were wet, his face stripped down to something I hadn't seen since he was 17, and Sandra had been diagnosed with a precancerous scare that turned out to be nothing. Raw, terrified, ashamed. "You are not going to lose your license," I said, "and you are not going to fight this alone. Not anymore." He stared at me. "Dad, you don't understand what they're capable of." "Son," I said, and I let just enough of what I'd been carrying for the past 3 weeks into my voice, just enough so he could hear that I was not walking into this unprepared. I think I understand more than you know. Now, let me tell you what I've been doing. What happened over the next 6 weeks didn't look like much from the outside. On the surface, everything stayed exactly the same. Ethan went home to Victoria that Wednesday evening and slipped back into the life she had constructed for him, the dutiful husband, the compliant son-in-law, the man who had learned to keep his voice pleasant and his eyes down. Victoria saw nothing different. Preston Hayes continued making his calls, moving his pieces, believing he was playing a game nobody else could see. But underneath all of that, something had changed completely. I want to walk you through what those 6 weeks and the months of quieter work that preceded them actually produced. Because the truth doesn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It accumulates. It builds itself piece by piece the way a wall gets built one stone at a time until one day you step back and realize what you've constructed. I had started carrying Marcus's recorder in June, 2 months before I even met the man. After the Saturday morning visit, when I had sat in Ethan's kitchen watching my son's eyes slide sideways every time Victoria moved, I had gone home and found an old handheld recorder in my desk drawer from when I used to dictate notes for property maintenance schedules. Nothing sophisticated, but it worked. And every time I was in a conversation with Victoria or Preston, I made sure it was running. When I finally met Marcus in August, I handed him 7 recordings. He listened to everyone, confirmed they were all legally obtained under Texas's one-party consent law, and had them professionally transcribed and time-stamped. After Ethan and I talked on the back porch in September, the operation became a partnership. Here's what I need you to do, I told Ethan the following Saturday when Victoria had left for a charity luncheon in the Woodlands. I drove down to Houston, and we sat in his home office with the door closed. You want me to spy on my own wife, he said flatly. I want you to document what is already happening, I said. There's a difference. He rubbed his face with both hands. Dad, if she finds out, she won't, I said. You're not doing anything she's not already doing to both of us. You're just writing it down. He looked at me for a long moment, jaw working. Then he said, What do I do? Start with the bank account, I said. The joint checking, the one she manages. Log into it tonight and look back 6 months. Write down every transaction you don't recognize. Don't move any money, don't close anything, don't tip her off. Just look. Ethan called me the next morning, and his voice had gone very quiet in a way that told me he had found something before he said a single word. There are transfers, he said. $47,000 spread across 8 months, all under $10,000 at a time, all going to something called Hazelwood Property Consulting. My grip on the phone tightened. You recognize that name? Never heard of it in my life, Ethan said. But Victoria handles all the household accounts. I never looked closely enough. Dad, she's been moving money out of our joint account, and I didn't even... He stopped. I heard him pull in a sharp breath. I didn't even notice. Take screenshots, I said. Send them to me. Don't say a word to her. I forwarded everything to Marcus the same afternoon. He ran Hazelwood Property Consulting through the Texas Secretary of State's Business Registration Database, a completely public record that anyone can access. The LLC was registered in Delaware 18 months ago. The registered agent was listed as a law firm in Wilmington. The managing member buried in the operating agreement filed with the state was Claire Hayes. When Marcus called me with that information, I was standing at the kitchen sink, and I had to grip the edge of the counter with both hands to keep steady. Claire Hayes, I said. Victoria's mother. That's correct, Marcus said. And there's more. I pulled Preston Hayes' business filings going back 5 years. Hayes Capital Properties has a documented consulting relationship with a Dallas-based development company called Summit Corridor Partners. I found the relationship through public SEC filings and Texas business records. He paused. Harold Summit Corridor Partners has been acquiring land parcels along the Montgomery County Highway Expansion Corridor for the past 3 years. Their acquisition list, which they filed publicly as part of a development disclosure, includes parcels on both sides of your property line. Yours is the gap in the middle. The room felt like it tilted sideways. When did Summit first appear on Preston's filings? I asked. April of 2022, Marcus said. April 2022. 4 months before Ethan brought Victoria home to the farm for the first time. 4 months before the Sunday dinner, where she had smiled at me and asked about the pecan trees with her measuring eyes. Marcus, I said, and my voice came out low and shaky. This wasn't an accident. None of it. No, Marcus said. It wasn't. They identified your property, identified you as a single point of access through your son, and built a relationship specifically to get close enough to execute. This is what patient fraud looks like, Harold. This took planning. I lowered myself into a kitchen chair because my legs had decided they were done standing for the moment. My hands were flat on the table, those old, calloused hands, and I stared at them while everything I had told myself for 2 years, that I was being paranoid, that Preston was just a nosy man, that Victoria was just difficult, dissolved completely. What's next? I said. I need you to come in. Because, I have one more thing to show you. I need you to see it in person. A pause. And Harold, I need you to be sitting down when you do. I drove to Houston the next morning, and I sat in Marcus Webb's office, and he placed a document in front of me on the desk. 3 pages legal paper notary stamp on the last page. A power of attorney document granting authority over all real property held by Harold James Miller to a named representative. At the bottom was my signature, the one I had written tens of thousands of times over 68 years on checks and contracts, and the deed to 45 acres of Texas land. I knew every curve of it. I knew exactly how the H of Harold slanted left and how the second L in Miller ran slightly long. And looking at what was on that page, I knew with the absolute certainty of a man reading his own name that I had never once touched that pen. I know my own handwriting. I have signed my name tens of thousands of times over 68 years, on equipment invoices, on property tax documents, on the deed to 45 acres of Texas land that my father bought before I was old enough to walk it. I know the way the H in Harold leans slightly to the left. I know the way the second L in Miller runs just a touch longer than the first, a habit I picked up from my father's signature that I never bothered to correct because it felt like carrying a piece of him with me. I sat in Marcus Webb's office, and I looked at the signature on that power of attorney document for a full minute without speaking, and what I felt was not confusion. It was the cold, clear certainty of a man looking at a violation. That was not my hand. That was not my pen. That was not my name. It was a copy of my name, careful and studied, made by someone who had practiced it enough to get close, but not close enough to fool the person who had been writing it since childhood. How did you get this? I asked Marcus, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. Montgomery County Clerk's Office has an online portal where you can monitor filing activity on specific properties, Marcus said, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. I set up an alert on your parcel number the first week we started working together. 3 days ago, someone attempted to file this document. It's sitting in a processing queue. It has not yet been officially recorded, which means it hasn't legally taken effect. But Harold, it was 48 hours away from becoming a matter of public record. My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. If this had gone through, I said, what could they have done with it? A properly recorded power of attorney grants the named representative full legal authority to act on your behalf in all property matters, Marcus said. They could have signed a purchase agreement in your name, transferred title, accepted payment into an account you had no access to, all of it appearing on paper to have your full authorization. He paused. The representative named on the document is a title company in Delaware I've never heard of, which tells me the transaction was designed to move fast and far before anyone could trace it. I stood up from that chair because I could not sit still any longer. I walked to the window, put one hand on the glass, and looked down at Westheimer Road, 4 floors below. Oh, the traffic, the ordinary movement of ordinary people going about their ordinary Wednesday. None of them with any idea that somewhere in a stack of processing paperwork, 68 years of a man's life was sitting 48 hours from being stolen. "Marcus," I said, "what do we do?" "We go see Daniel Reeves," Marcus said. "Today, right now if he can take us." Daniel Reeves's office was in the Woodlands 30 minutes north on I-45, in a low brick building, set back from a quiet street lined with live oaks. I had used Daniel for a property transaction 15 years ago, and found him to be a man who spoke plainly and charged fairly, which in my experience is a rarer combination than it should be. His assistant showed us in without an appointment, because Marcus had called ahead from the car, and Daniel met us at the door of his office with the expression of a man who had been told enough on the phone to already be concerned. He was in his late 50s, trim with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a yellow legal pad already open on his desk. He shook my hand, shook Marcus's, and said, "Sit down, Harold. Let's see what we have." Marcus laid the power of attorney document on Daniel's desk. Daniel picked it up, read it through once, then again, more slowly, then set it down and removed his reading glasses entirely and looked at me. "Is this your signature?" he asked. "No," I said. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am of anything in my life," I said. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "Harold, under Texas Penal Code Section 32.21, forging a legal document related to real property is a third-degree felony. That's 2 to 10 years in a Texas state prison." He tapped the document with one finger. "And because this was almost certainly transmitted electronically at some stage of its preparation, we're also looking at potential federal wire fraud charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. That's federal. That's FBI jurisdiction. That's up to 20 years. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "What do we do right now?" I asked. "Today, 2 things simultaneously," Daniel said, sitting forward and picking up his pen. "First, I am filing an immediate legal hold on your property parcel with Montgomery County. This flags your deed record so that no transfers, liens, or encumbrances can be recorded without a secondary verification process. It goes into effect within 24 hours, and it costs nothing except my time." He wrote something on the legal pad. "Second, I strongly recommend we do not contact law enforcement today." I frowned. "Why not?" "Because the moment the Hayes family knows, you know they will move," Daniel said, meeting my eyes directly. "Documents disappear. Witnesses become unavailable. Money moves offshore. Right now they believe this filing is still sitting quietly in a processing queue. They don't know Marcus pulled it. They don't know you're sitting in my office." He leaned back. "We use that window. We lock your asset first, then we let law enforcement move with the full package, everything Marcus has compiled, everything Ethan has documented, the forged document. The LLC transfers all of it together. That is a case. What you have right now is a very good start." I thought about that for a moment, testing it against every instinct I had. Part of me, the part that had been raised to solve things directly, man to man, without dragging other people in, wanted to drive to Preston Hayes' office and put the document on his desk and watch his face. But I thought about Sandra, about what she would have said. "Let the truth breathe, Harold. Give it room to work." "All right," I said. "What's the third thing?" Daniel almost smiled. "The third thing," he said, "is a revocable living trust, and I want you to understand exactly what that is before we proceed, because it's the most important tool we have." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining it in plain language. "A revocable living trust," he said, "is a legal structure where I transfer ownership of my property to the trust itself, a legal entity that I control completely while I'm alive. I become the trustee, meaning I manage it. I become the beneficiary, meaning I benefit from it. And I name Ethan as the successor beneficiary, meaning when I'm gone it passes to him without going through probate. The critical point, the part that made something loosen in my chest like a knot finally releasing, was this: while I am alive, no transaction involving trust property can be executed without my direct in-person, notarized signature in front of two independent witnesses, not a power of attorney, not a court order without due process. Nothing. Victoria Hayes's name would not appear anywhere in this document. Claire Hayes's name would not appear. Preston Hayes's name would not appear. If they try to file anything else against this property after the trust is recorded, Daniel said, they'll hit a wall they cannot climb. How long does it take? I asked. I can have the draft ready in a week, Daniel said. We review together, make any changes, sign before a notary with two witnesses. 11 days start to finish if we move efficiently. I leaned forward in my chair and looked at Daniel Reeves straight on. Move efficiently, I said. Before I tell you what Ethan and I decided to do next, I need to know you're still with me. Drop a "still here" in the comments right now. No fancy words needed. Just let me know you haven't left, because what's coming next changes everything. And a gentle reminder, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. If that's not for you, it's okay to step away now. But if you're staying, you'll want to hear this next part. The paperwork took 11 days exactly. Daniel was the kind of lawyer who treated every word in a legal document, the way a surgeon treats every incision, deliberate, tested, nothing left to chance. He called me 4 times during those 11 days, with questions that might have seemed small but weren't. Did I want a specific clause about agricultural use? Did I want a provision protecting the mineral rights separately? Was there any personal property equipment, vehicles, livestock I wanted included in the trust schedule? Each time he called, I answered his questions and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Like the ground was solidifying under my feet again. Like I was building something instead of just watching something be taken. On a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of October, I drove back down to Daniel's office in the Woodlands, and I signed the trust document. 41 pages. Daniel walked me through every section before I put pen to paper, and his notary, a young woman named Carol, who had been with his office for 12 years, witnessed every signature along with Daniel's paralegal. When it was done, Daniel slid the executed copy across the desk to me in a manila envelope, with my name printed on the front in his assistant's careful hand. "That's it?" I asked, holding the envelope. "That's it," Daniel said. "As of this moment, that property is in a trust structure that would take a court order after full due process to penetrate. And the attempted power of attorney forgery gives us stand to fight any such order before it gets anywhere near a judge." He took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. "Harold, I want you to hear me clearly. You have done everything right. You have been patient when it would have been easier to react. You have built a case that will hold." My throat tightened. I pressed my lips together for a moment before I trusted my voice. "Daniel," I said, "my wife left me a notebook that told me not to sell this land. She wrote it when she was sick. She couldn't have known the details of what was coming, but she knew something was wrong, and she left me a map." I stopped. "I don't want to let her down." Daniel looked at me for a moment, with an expression that had nothing professional in it at all, just one human being looking at another. "You haven't," he said quietly. "You won't." I drove home to Conroe alone that evening. The October air coming through the truck windows was finally cool enough to breathe properly, the way Texas air gets in the fall, when it remembers it doesn't have to be brutal. I took the long way up FM 1314, instead of the interstate past the fields and the stands of pine and the small houses set back from the road, with their porch lights already on. When I got home, I didn't go inside right away. I walked around the side of the house to the back porch, and I sat down in my chair, the one on the left, the one that had always been mine, and I looked out at 45 acres of dark Texas land under an October sky so clear it looked like something had polished it. The pecan trees were shadows. The south field was black and still. Somewhere out in the dark, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire, cycling through stolen songs, in the way mockingbirds do, borrowing every voice it had ever heard. I held the manila envelope in my lap with both hands. "It's locked, Sandra," I said out loud to the dark, to the empty chair beside me, to wherever she was, that still felt close enough to hear me on nights like this. 45 acres, 3 generations. Nobody's taking it. The mockingbird kept singing. The pines moved in the breeze. And sitting there in the dark with the trust document in my hands and the October air cooling the back of my neck, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, but the deep, settled quiet of a man who has done what needed to be done. Then I picked up my phone and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" "Everything's fine, son," I said. "Better than fine." I looked out at the land one more time. "I just wanted to let you know the garden is ready." A pause. I heard him breathe in slowly. Then very quietly, Yeah, I said. "We're ready." Another pause. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had something in it I hadn't heard in almost a year, a steadiness, a weight that wasn't burden, resolve. "Then I'll talk to Devin tomorrow," he said. "We've got 3 weeks." 3 weeks, I agreed. "Dad," he said before I could hang up. "Yeah, thank you." His voice cracked just slightly at the edges. "For not giving up on me. For not walking away when I gave you every reason to." My eyes went hot and stinging, and I tilted my head back and looked up at the October stars for a moment before I answered. "Ethan James Miller." I said, "You have been the best thing I ever had a hand in. There is no version of this story where I walk away from you." I stopped, cleared my throat. "Now go get some sleep. We've got work to do." He laughed, a real laugh, short and slightly wet, the laugh of a man who has been holding something painful for a very long time and just felt it release an inch. "Yes, sir," he said. I sat on that porch for another half hour after we hung up, listening to the mockingbird, watching the stars, thinking about Sandra and my father and the 3 generations of early mornings and hard work and stubborn love that had built this place. Thinking about what Marcus had said weeks ago in that office on Westheimer. We're going to let the truth do what it does. 4 days later, Marcus called again. He said there was one more piece. He said I needed to see it in person. And when I sat in his office the following morning, and he opened the file on his laptop, I understood for the first time why Ethan had looked the way he looked that Wednesday afternoon, when he showed up at my farm without calling ahead. Some things you have to see to understand the full weight of. And what was on that screen was going to change everything about the night that was still 3 weeks away. Marcus Webb delivered bad news the way a good doctor does, directly, without softening it into something easier to swallow, and with the information you needed to actually do something about it. I drove to his office on Westheimer the morning after he called, parked in the same garage I always used, rode the same slow elevator to the 4th floor. But this time, when I walked through that frosted glass door, Marcus had already cleared his desk. Both monitors were on. A thick folder sat in the center of the desk, and beside it, his laptop was open to something I couldn't see from the door. "Sit down, Harold," he said without preamble. "I want to walk you through everything in order. Don't react until I get through all 3. Can you do that for me?" "I've had practice," I said, lowering myself into the chair. He picked up the folder and opened it to the first section. "You already know about the LLC transfers from Ethan's joint account, $47,000 moved to Hazelwood Property Consulting over 8 months. What you didn't have before is this." He turned the folder toward me. Inside was a printout of Delaware State business records, the full operating agreement for Hazelwood Property Consulting, including a certified copy obtained through a legal records request. I pulled Hazelwood's Certificate of Formation from Delaware's Public Business Registry, the only document they're required to file publicly. It listed a Wilmington law firm as registered agent, which told me nothing on its own. But once the FBI opened their investigation 3 days before the party, they subpoenaed the full operating agreement. A contact at the Bureau confirmed what was inside Claire Hayes' sole managing member, with a stated business purpose of acquiring and disposing of real property assets in the Southeast Texas corridor on behalf of affiliated development interests. I stared at that phrase, acquisition and disposition, buying and selling, my land. She wrote it right into the company documents. I said, my voice coming out flat with disbelief. People who believe they won't get caught tend to be careless about paperwork, Marcus said. He moved to the second section. Second piece. You know, Preston Hayes has a relationship with Summit Corridor Partners out of Dallas. What I have now are the actual communications. He pulled out a printed email chain. These came from a business intelligence database that licensed investigators use to cross-reference disclosed filings across multiple jurisdictions. Summit Corridor Partners had listed Preston Hayes as a consulting partner in a Texas Secretary of State disclosure public record. From there, I was able to document the relationship formally. The specific content of their communications came later through the FBI subpoena. I leaned forward. The highlighted text read, "The Miller parcel is the critical gap in the corridor acquisition. 45 acres, single owner, no mortgage, no liens. Owner is elderly widowed, sole heir is the son. We are developing an approach through a family connection. Timeline is 18 to 24 months from relationship establishment to transfer execution." My hands curled against my thighs. The edges of my vision went sharp and strange. Developing an approach through a family connection. My son. They had used my son as an instrument, planned it, written it down, filed it in documents that would sit in a government office in Austin, while Ethan sat in his apartment in Houston, believing he was falling in love. "Harold." Marcus's voice was steady, pulling me back. "Stay with me, there's one more." I breathed in slowly through my nose. "Go ahead." He moved to the third section. This one came from Ethan. About 3 weeks ago, he was in the kitchen at River Oaks when Claire Hayes left her phone on the counter and went to answer the door. He saw a message thread open on the screen between Victoria and Claire on a messaging app they used. He photographed what was visible. He sent it to me. Marcus pulled out a printed screenshot. "I want you to know Ethan did not access Claire's phone or her accounts. He photographed what was already visible on an unlocked screen in a shared space. Texas law does not explicitly prohibit capturing what is voluntarily displayed in a common area, and our attorneys are prepared to defend the admissibility of what he captured if it comes to that." I took the screenshot and read it. Victoria's message dated 6 weeks before the housewarming party. He's completely in the dark. Even Ethan doesn't know the full timeline. Dad says the filing is ready to go the week before the party. We just need the old man to not make waves for 3 more weeks. Claire's response: "He won't. Men like him trust the people they raised. That's always been the weakness." I set the paper down on the desk. My chest felt like something had reached inside it and squeezed. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. The recognition of having been measured, calculated, and dismissed by people who had decided that 68 years of honest living made me easy to fool. "Marcus," I said, and my voice was very quiet. "Is there a video of anything?" Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he reached for his laptop and turned it to face me. "I need you to know what this is before I play it," he said. 6 weeks ago, you told me you were going to install a security camera at the Conroe property. I said it was a good idea. You did it yourself, mounted it in the living room, covering the main wall, your property, your home, completely legal under Texas law. No notification required to visitors. He paused. Victoria came to the farm 5 weeks ago while you were out checking the south fence line. She let herself in with the key Ethan had given her 2 years ago. I didn't know she was there, I said. I know, Marcus said. The camera caught her. He pressed play. The footage was 43 seconds long. Victoria walked into my living room, the room with Sandra's photographs on the wall. Our wedding portrait. The photo from Ethan's kindergarten graduation. The one of Sandra standing in the back garden the summer before she got sick, laughing at something just off camera, looking more alive than anyone I had ever known. Victoria stood in front of those photographs. She tilted her head slightly, the way you tilt your head at something mildly interesting in a museum. Then she pulled out her phone, opened FaceTime, and held it up so Claire could see the wall. God, she said, with a small light laugh that sounded like she was commenting on old wallpaper. Even dead, she takes up space. Claire's voice came through the phone speaker, small and clear. Just a little longer, sweetheart. After the transfer, you won't have to look at any of it. 43 seconds. Then Victoria pocketed her phone and walked out of the frame, and the living room was empty again, and Sandra's photograph was still on the wall, still smiling at something just beyond the edge of the picture. Marcus closed the laptop. I sat in that chair, and I pressed both hands flat on my thighs, and I breathed the way you breathe when something has hit you so hard that your body needs to be reminded it still knows how. My jaw ached from how hard I was holding it together. My eyes burned with a heat I refused to let become tears. Not here, not yet, not for this. Harold, Marcus said carefully. I'm all right, I said. I wasn't entirely, but I was enough. What do we do with it? Everything I have, the LLC records, the email chain, the screenshots, the forged power of attorney, the audio recordings you made, and this video goes into a single package, Marcus said. Authenticated, time-stamped, organized. I have a forensic audio and video specialist who will certify the recordings haven't been altered. That certification is what makes it bulletproof in court. He leaned forward. And then, Harold, you and Ethan decide how you want to use it. I stood up. My legs felt steadier than I expected. I know exactly how we're going to use it, I said. I need to make a phone call. The next morning, I drove to a diner on the south end of Conroe, a small place called Early Bird Cafe that had been there since 1979 and still used paper menus and refilled your coffee without being asked. Ethan was already in the corner booth when I arrived, both hands wrapped around a mug, wearing the expression of a man who had not slept much and was running on something more stubborn than rest. I slid in across from him. The waitress, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and a name tag that said Ruth Ann, poured my coffee before I could ask and disappeared. You said it was important, Ethan said, studying my face the way he had studied it since he was a boy, trying to read whatever I wasn't saying out loud. What did Marcus find? I'm going to tell you everything, I said, but I need you to hear it in order, and I need you to not react until I finish. Same rules you gave me on the back porch. Something moved across his face, recognition, and the particular kind of dread that comes from knowing the thing you're about to hear is going to be worse than you already feared. Okay, he said. I walked him through it. The Delaware operating agreement naming Claire as managing member of Hazelwood. The email from Preston to Summit Corridor Partners dated April 2022. I watched Ethan's jaw tighten like a vice as I read him the highlighted section, the part about developing an approach through a family connection. His coffee mug rotated slowly between his palms as I spoke around and around, like he needed something to do with his hands, to keep from putting them through the table. He planned it before I even met her, Ethan said when I finished that section. His voice was hollow, scrubbed out. Dad, I thought I found her. I thought it was real. I know you did, son, I said. Was any of it real? His voice cracked at the edges, raw and ragged. Was there a single moment in the last 2 years that wasn't Ethan? I reached across the table and put my hand over his. His knuckles were white around the mug. That's not a question you need to answer today. There's something else you need to hear first. He looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed and fighting hard. There's a video, I said. I took my phone out of my pocket. Marcus had sent me the clip that morning, properly certified by his forensic specialist. I turned the phone to face Ethan, and I pressed play. I watched my son watch 43 seconds of footage. His face, when Victoria appeared on the screen, went very still, the stillness of someone bracing. He watched her stand in front of Sandra's photographs. He watched her pull out her phone. He watched her tilt her head at 40 years of his parents' life and laugh that small, practiced laugh. And when her voice came through the phone speaker. God, even dead, she takes up space. Something happened in Ethan's face that I had never seen before and hope never to see again. It was the expression of a man having something broken inside him that he hadn't known was still intact. His eyes went glassy and then went hard. His chin dropped forward. A sound came out of him, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something between the two that had no name. His shoulders shook once violently, like a tree hit by something too fast to dodge. Ethan, I said. That's my mother, he said, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. That is my mother's photograph, and she... He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. His eyes squeezed shut, and 2 tears ran straight down his face, and he made no move to wipe them away like he had forgotten they were there. I moved around to his side of the booth and put my arm around my son's shoulders, the way I had when he was 6 years old, and the world had been unkind to him, and I held on while he pulled himself back together. It took a minute. Ruth Ann came by with the coffee pot, took one look at us, and quietly turned around. When Ethan finally lifted his head, his eyes were red and raw, but something else had moved into them, the same locked-in calm I had seen on his face in the River Oaks lobby when he whispered in my ear to trust him. Resolve hard and finished the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Tell me the plan, he said. All of it. So I did. I told him about Devon, his old college friend, the audiovisual technician, who had already agreed to help when Ethan had quietly reached out 2 weeks earlier. I explained how the venue had agreed to a final hour technical edition under the cover of a romantic photo display. I laid out the sequence, the LLC records first, then Preston's emails, then Claire's text, then the video building the case in the room, the way you build a case in a courtroom, from document to document, until the picture was so complete that no one in that room could look away from it. Marcus's forensic specialist has certified every piece of audio and video, I said. Daniel Reeves will be present at the party, Ethan. He'll identify himself if needed. Everything we show is legally obtained and authenticated. Ethan listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table, his coffee untouched and cold, his eyes never leaving mine. What do you need from me? He said when I finished. I need you to go back to that house tonight and act like nothing has changed, I said. I need you to smile at dinner and answer her questions and give her absolutely nothing to be suspicious about for 3 more weeks. Can you do that? He almost laughed, a short, painful sound. Dad, I've been doing that for 7 months. I know, I said. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. You know now, Ethan said. He straightened in the booth, rolled his shoulders back, and when he looked at me next, his face had settled into something I recognized from Sandra, that particular quality of stillness that isn't passivity but preparation. 3 weeks, he said. Then it's over. Then it's over, I agreed. He finally picked up his coffee mug and took a long drink of cold coffee without flinching, the way a man drinks something unpleasant, because he has decided the unpleasantness is worth it. Devon's confirmed for the setup, he said. I talked to him last night. He'll arrive at the venue 2 hours before the party, tell the manager it's a multimedia display for the housewarming, and have everything tested before the first guest walks in. He set the mug down. And Dad, I need you to promise me something. Name it, I said. When it happens, he said, holding my eyes. I need you to stay in your seat. No matter what she says, no matter what Preston does, I need you to let it run. Let the recordings play. Let the room do what the room is going to do. His jaw was set, his voice was steady. You've earned the right to sit there and watch. Let me handle the standing up part. I looked at my son for a long moment. This boy I had raised on 45 acres of Texas earth. This man who had walked into the hardest year of his life and come out the other side of it still standing, still mine. I promise, I said. He nodded once. We finished our coffee. We paid Ruth Ann and she smiled at us like she understood more than we had told her, which was probably true of anyone who had worked a corner booth diner long enough. We walked out into the October morning together, and the air was cool and the light was coming through the pine trees at that low, slanted angle that makes Texas look for a few hours a day like something someone painted. 3 weeks. Everything we had built over 6 months, every recording and document and certified file was going to walk into that party inside a thumb drive in Devon's jacket pocket. And I was going to sit in my Navy suit with my calloused hands folded in my lap and wait for the truth to do what Marcus Webb had promised it would do. I set my alarm for 6 the next morning, but I was already sitting on the edge of my bed at 4:30, vest in my hands, the house quiet around me the way only a house that has been lived in alone for 3 years can be quiet. I stood up and walked to the mirror on the back of the closet door, the full-length one Sandra had insisted on when we remodeled the bedroom. In 2003, the one I had complained about, because it meant losing 6 inches of shelf space and had been right about that mirror every single day since. I shook the vest out, smoothed the lapels, and put it on over my dress shirt. The man looking back at me was 68 years old, silver at the temples, deeper lines around the eyes than I remembered putting there. Shoulders that had curved slightly forward from 4 decades of bending over soil and machinery. Hands at my sides with the calluses my father had called the only honest jewelry a working man ever owned. I stood there and looked at that man for a long time. Well, I said out loud to the mirror, to the empty room, to whoever was listening. Here we are. I thought about my father, James Miller, pipe fitter from Georgia man, who had bought 45 acres of Texas dirt with 15 years of wages because he believed in the mathematics of land. He used to say that a piece of ground never lied to you, never changed its story, depending on who was in the room, never pretended to be something it wasn't. I used to think he was talking about farming. I understood now he was talking about everything. I reached out and straightened the mirror slightly, an old habit Sandra used to tease me about. You know what today is? I said to the mirror, to her, to the air that still carried some quality of her presence in this room even 3 years later. You knew before I did, didn't you? You wrote it down in that notebook, and you trusted I'd find it when I needed it. You trusted me to do the right thing with it. My voice went rough at the edges, and I let it. There was no one here to hold it together for. I hope I'm doing the right thing, Sandra. I think I am. I think you'd say so. The mirror showed me a 68-year-old man with wet eyes, which I wiped with the back of my hand without ceremony. I walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, through the kitchen, and out onto the back porch. The November air hit me immediately, cool and sharp, and smelling of pine and the particular darkness that comes before a Texas dawn, when the sky is the color of deep water, and the land is a black shape against it. I stood at the porch railing and looked out at 45 acres that my father's hands had bought, and my hands had kept. 3 generations. My grandfather had worked Georgia soil his whole life and died owning none of it. My father had driven 600 miles west and bought land with money he saved $1 at a time. And I had spent my life understanding that the land was not just an asset, It was a record, a physical document of what our family had been willing to endure and refused to surrender. Victoria Hayes had stood in my living room and looked at Sandra's photographs and laughed. Preston Hayes had written the words, "Elderly widowed sole heir is the son" in a business email, and treated those words as a vulnerability to be exploited. Claire Hayes had texted her daughter that men like me trust the people we raised, and called it a weakness. I gripped the porch railing and felt the old wood under my palms, rough, familiar, honest. "It is not a weakness," I said to the dark. "It is the whole point." I went inside and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn quiet and drank it slowly. And I thought about Ethan, not the Ethan of the last 19 months, pale and careful, and carrying something too heavy, but the Ethan of the back porch, the one who had pressed his forehead into his hands and then lifted his eyes to mine and asked me not to give up on him. I thought about the way his voice had sounded on the phone after I signed the trust documents. "Thank you for not walking away from me." A man could spend a lifetime building something and lose it in a season. Or he could decide quietly and without announcement that the season was going to end on his terms. I finished my coffee. I washed the mug. I went back to the bedroom, stood in front of the mirror one more time, and adjusted the vest lapel. "All right," I said. "Let's go." I set the alarm anyway, out of habit, out of respect for the ordinary rhythms of ordinary days. But I was already in the truck, pulling out of the Conroe driveway before it ever had the chance to ring. So now you know everything I knew when I walked back through those doors. You know about Sandra's notebook, and the 45 acres, and the 3 months Preston Hayes had spent planning how to take them before his daughter ever met my son. You know about the recorder in my shirt pocket, and the trust document locked in Daniel's safe, and the 43 seconds of footage that had broken something in Ethan's face and rebuilt it harder. You know what Ethan whispered in my ear in that lobby and why. Now let me tell you what the next 2 hours actually looked like from where I was sitting. I arrived at the River Oaks house at 7:15, 45 minutes before the first guests, because Ethan had asked me to. He met me at the side entrance off the kitchen, and we stood together in the narrow hallway for 30 seconds, while he checked my face the way a man checks the weather before a long drive. "You good?" he asked. "I'm good," I said. "Devin's set up in the media room." Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "Everything tested. The screen in the main room will mirror his laptop on my signal." He reached into his jacket pocket and showed me his phone, a specific text thread open, one contact labeled "Only D." One message. That's all it takes. "And Daniel?" I asked. "Third table from the left," Ethan said. "He'll introduce himself if it comes to that. Marcus says the forensic certification documents are with him in a folder." He looked at me one more time. "Dad, remember what you promised me." "I'll stay in my seat," I said. "I'll let you handle the standing up part." He nodded. Then he straightened his jacket, rolled his shoulders back, and walked toward the sound of arriving guests, like a man walking toward something he had decided to stop running from. And I followed him in. The party was already alive by 8 o'clock. 63 guests by my rough count, filling the main room and the adjacent dining area with the warm noise of people who believed they had been invited to a celebration. Catered food on long tables, a string quartet doing something tasteful near the fireplace, the smell of expensive candles and fresh flowers. Victoria moved through it all like water finding its own level, effortless, luminous, the center of every small constellation of conversation she touched. I found the table with Ethan's engineering colleagues and settled in. 3 men and 2 women, all somewhere in their 30s and 40s, all with the comfortable directness of people who solved real problems for a living. A man named Greg shook my hand and asked about the Conroe property. A woman named Alicia said she had grown up in Magnolia and knew the area. I talked to them about the land, about the pecan trees, about the difference between Montgomery County clay and the sandy loam closer to the coast, and every few minutes I let my eyes move across the room. Preston Hayes held court near the bar with three men I didn't recognize. The kind of conversation that involved a lot of nodding and the occasional gesture toward the hypothetical future. He had a whiskey in one hand and the posture of a man who believed every room he stood in was lucky to have him. Once his eyes found mine across the crowd, and he gave me the brief, pleasant nod you give someone whose name you've decided not to bother remembering. I nodded back and returned to my conversation with Greg about drainage gradients. Claire Hayes materialized near Victoria at regular intervals, touching her daughter's elbow, leaning close to say something that made Victoria's smile calibrate slightly. They were operating together the way two people operate when they have rehearsed their roles so thoroughly that the performance looks like instinct. And Ethan moved through that room with a composure that cost him more than anyone watching him could have possibly understood. He laughed at the right moments. He refilled glasses. He introduced guests to each other with the ease of a man who was entirely at home in his own house and entirely in control of his own evening. Victoria watched him with the particular satisfaction of someone who believes they have trained something well. She had no idea she was watching a man run a play. At 9:15, Ethan passed my table and let his fingers brush the back of my chair so brief that anyone watching would have thought it was accidental. I felt it, and I understood it. Devon was ready. Daniel was in position. The window was open. I set down my water glass. I folded my calloused hands on the table in front of me. I looked at my son across that bright, beautiful lying room, and I felt something move through my chest that I can only describe as the sensation of a door opening onto a very large space. Then Victoria picked up the small microphone near the fireplace, tapped it twice, and smiled at the room with every watt of the considerable power she had spent 2 years constructing. "Before the evening wraps up," she said, warm and gracious and utterly certain of herself, "we have a little surprise for everyone." She looked across the room at Ethan, and in her eyes was the expression I had been watching for 2 years. The look of a woman who believed she had already won. Ethan smiled back at her. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, took out his phone, and typed one word to the contact labeled D, and the screen on the far wall of the living room came to life. Victoria's smile was still perfectly in place when Ethan stepped forward and gently took the microphone from her hand. It happened so smoothly that half the room didn't register the transfer. One moment Victoria was holding it, the next Ethan had it, and his hand on her wrist was so light, so practiced, that it looked like a gesture of affection rather than a redirection. Victoria's smile flickered 1/2 second of recalibration, and then steadied. She stepped back 1 pace and tilted her head, the gracious hostess yielding the floor to her husband. She had no idea she had just handed him the detonator. "Before the evening closes," Ethan said, and his voice came out clear and calm and reached every corner of that room without needing to be raised. "There is something I need every person here to understand." The room felt the shift before it understood it. Conversations died at different speeds, like lights going out in a building 1 floor at a time. The string quartet, catching something in the air, let their last note trail away. 63 people turned toward my son. Victoria's smile dropped 2 degrees. Not gone yet, just cooled. "Ethan." Her voice was musical warning wrapped in warmth. "Sweetheart, what are you?" "Victoria." He said her name the way you say the name of something you have decided to set down. Then he looked back at the room and nodded once toward the far wall. The screen behind him lit up. I watched the room the way Marcus had taught me to watch things, not the screen, but the faces. Because the screen was showing what I already knew. The faces were showing me what I needed to see. The first audio file began to play. Victoria's voice came through the room's speakers, relaxed, unhurried, completely, unlike the woman standing 6 feet away in her carefully chosen dress. The recording was from a Tuesday evening 4 months prior, captured on the device in my shirt pocket while we sat in Ethan's kitchen, and she had offered me coffee and asked about my land. The timeline is 3 weeks, Mom. Dad says the corridor acquisition needs that parcel before the public survey drops. Once we have the power of attorney recorded, it's done. Claire's voice through the same recording. And if Harold resists, Victoria. He won't. He's too focused on Ethan to look sideways. A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp, something more restrained and more devastating than a gasp. The sound of 63 people arriving simultaneously at the edge of understanding. A woman near the front pressed her fingers to her lips. A man in a dark jacket straightened slowly in his chair, his wine glass stopping halfway to his mouth. Greg, sitting 2 seats from me at the engineer's table, put his fork down without looking at it. Preston Hayes' face went the color of old concrete. He took 1 step forward from his position near the bar, and his voice came out hard and commanding in the way that voices come out when the person using them is accustomed to being obeyed. "Turn that off," he said. "That recording is edited. That is taken completely out of—" "Mr. Hayes?" Ethan's voice was still level, still unhurried. "All audio recordings were made under Texas Penal Code Section 16.02, which permits recording by any consenting party to a conversation. My father was present for every recording you will hear tonight. Every word is certified, unaltered by a forensic audio specialist." He paused. "The documentation is available for anyone who wants to review it." The second piece appeared on the screen, not audio this time, but a document. The email chain between Preston Hayes and Summit Corridor Partners, the one with the April 2022 timestamp. Key passages were highlighted in yellow and large enough to read from across the room. The Miller parcel is the critical gap in the corridor acquisition. Owner is elderly widowed, sole heir is the son. We are developing an approach through a family connection. Timeline is 18 to 24 months from relationship establishment to transfer execution. I watched Preston's face change. The outrage dissolved into something raw, the expression of a man who has just seen his private calculations displayed on a 40-inch screen in front of 60 strangers. His jaw worked. His hand tightened on the empty whiskey glass until I thought the glass might break. "That is a fabrication," he said, but his voice had lost its command. It came out thinner than before, like something structural had given way underneath it. A man in the 3rd row stood up slowly. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the understated way of someone who didn't need clothing to establish his authority. He looked at Preston Hayes calmly and said, "Mr. Hayes, my name is Daniel Reeves. I'm a licensed real estate attorney in the state of Texas, and I was invited here this evening as a guest of Ethan Miller." He held up a folder. "I have reviewed every piece of evidence you are seeing tonight. The recordings are legally obtained. The financial records are authentic. The business correspondence was retrieved from public filings with the Texas General Land Office." He set the folder on the table in front of him. "Everything on that screen is real." A woman in the 4th row made a sound that wasn't quite a word. 2 men on Victoria's side of the room exchanged a look, and then very deliberately looked away from each other. Near the doorway, I saw someone reach for their coat. Victoria stepped toward Ethan, and her voice had dropped the warmth entirely now. What was underneath it was something flat and very cold. "Ethan, stop this right now," she said. "You are humiliating yourself. You are humiliating me. In front of our friends, in front of my family." "The 3rd item," Ethan said past her to the room. The screen changed again. The bank statement appeared, Ethan and Victoria's joint account, 8 months of transactions, each transfer to Hazelwood Property Consulting, highlighted. The total at the bottom, circled in red, $47,216. "That account is in both our names," Ethan said. "I am legally entitled to every record you are looking at. The receiving LLC Hazelwood Property Consulting is registered in Delaware with Claire Hayes as sole managing member." He turned and looked directly at his mother-in-law for the first time in the evening. Claire. Claire Hayes's face had gone very still. She was holding her wine glass at a slight angle as if she had forgotten it was in her hand, as if her body had stopped receiving signals from the part of her brain that managed ordinary things like grip and posture. Her eyes were moving, calculating rapidly, with an expression I recognized from watching people realize they have been outmaneuvered. Preston slammed his empty glass down on the nearest surface hard enough to make the people nearest to him flinch backward. "This is a setup," he said, his voice rising, now cracking at the upper register. "This is a vindictive, fabricated, Ethan, I swear to God if you don't." "There's one more thing," Ethan said, and the room went very, very quiet. The quiet in that room was different from any quiet I had ever heard in a room full of people. It wasn't the quiet of boredom or the quiet of politeness. It was the quiet that arrives when everyone present understands they are about to witness something they will not forget, and some instinct older than language tells them to stop moving and pay attention. Ethan looked at the screen. Then he looked at his phone. Then he pressed one button. 43 seconds. I had seen the footage twice before, once in Marcus's office, once across a diner table in Conroe. I knew every frame of it, so I did not watch the screen. I watched the room. Victoria appeared on the screen walking into my living room in Conroe. The room recognized her immediately. Heads turning, the particular sharpening of attention that comes with recognition. She was wearing the same silk blouse she had worn to Sunday dinner at the farm 8 weeks prior, and several people in that room had seen her in it. She stopped in front of Sandra's photographs on the wall. I watched a woman in the second row tilt her head, trying to understand what she was looking at. I watched Greg at the engineer's table lean forward, his elbows on the table, his face utterly focused. I watched Claire Hayes, who had set her wine glass down on a side table with the careful deliberateness of someone who needed both hands free for whatever was coming. On the screen, Victoria pulled out her phone. The FaceTime connection opened. Claire's face appeared on Victoria's screen, and through the audio system, the room heard Claire's voice come back small and clear, asking what was so funny. Victoria tilted the phone toward Sandra's photographs. "God," she said with that light, easy laugh. "Even dead, she takes up space." And Claire's voice, warm and intimate and utterly private. "Just a little longer, sweetheart. After the transfer, you won't have to look at any of it." The 43 seconds ended. The screen went dark. What happened next in that room happened slowly, the way the most important things tend to happen. Not all at once, but in stages, like a tide coming in. A woman in the fourth row pressed both hands over her mouth, and her shoulders began to shake. The man beside her put his arm around her, and his face was the face of someone trying to decide between rage and grief, and landing helplessly on both at the same time. A couple near the back stood up together, not dramatically, not with announcement, just with the quiet certainty of people who had decided they knew which side of something they wanted to be on. Greg pushed back from the engineer's table. His chair scraped the floor loud in the quiet. He looked at me, directly at me, for the first time since the screen had lit up, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something I understood completely, because I had felt it myself in Marcus Webb's office, looking at those same 43 seconds. He gave me a single nod. I nodded back. Victoria's voice, when it came, was nothing like the voice on the recording. That voice had been relaxed and certain. This voice was unraveling at every edge. That is out of context," she said, and the words tumbled over each other like something that had lost its footing. "You don't understand what you're Ethan. That was a private conversation. You had no right to. That camera was illegal. You can't just..." "The camera was installed by Harold Miller on his own property," Daniel Reeves said from his table without standing up, in the steady voice of a man who has said true things in difficult rooms before. "Texas law requires no notification to visitors on private residential property. The footage is completely admissible." "Ethan." Victoria's voice cracked down the middle, and what came through the crack was not remorse, but desperation, the desperation of someone watching a structure they built collapse and trying to find the one load-bearing wall that might still hold. "Ethan, please. Whatever you think you know, whatever they've told you, I love you. I have always—" "Don't." Ethan's voice was so quiet it was almost gentle. Almost. "Victoria, please don't." She stopped. Her chin dropped. And then in the middle of that room full of people who had watched her perform perfect hostess all evening, Victoria Hayes's face crumpled completely. Tears came fast and hard, streaking through the careful construction of her makeup, and she pressed one hand over her mouth and made a sound that was partly a sob and partly something that had no name. I sat in my chair with my hands folded on the table, and I let it happen. I had promised Ethan I would stay seated, and I kept that promise, though. I will tell you honestly that keeping it cost me something. Not because I felt sorry for Victoria Hayes in that moment, but because I am 68 years old, and I was raised in a world where a woman crying in a room full of people triggers something in a man's chest that 68 years of living doesn't entirely undo. I looked at Sandra's photograph on the screen, the one Devon had included in the display, the one of her laughing in the back garden, looking more alive than anyone had a right to look. And something settled in my chest. Something final and clean. Preston Hayes moved. He had been standing fixed for the last minute and a half, and now he came to life with the desperate energy of a man who has only one move left and knows it. He crossed the room toward the media room door, where Devon was operating the equipment. His face was red, his voice rising to a register I had not heard from him before, raw and stripped of all the careful construction of the evening. "Whoever is in that room needs to turn that equipment off right now," he said, his voice shaking. "This is my daughter's home, and I will not—" Three of Ethan's friends' men I had seen at the engineer's table, solid and large and entirely unimpressed with Preston Hayes's net worth, stepped into the space between Preston and the media room door. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. They simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, in the particular way that men stand when they have decided something is not going to happen. Preston stopped. Claire Hayes, across the room, had done something I found more telling than anything else in that room that evening. She had picked up her handbag from the back of her chair. She had smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. And she had taken 2 deliberate steps away from her daughter, not toward the door, not yet, but away from Victoria, creating a distance between them that was small in feet and vast in every other sense. I watched her do it. I saw the calculation in it. And I thought, there it is. That's who she is. That's who she has always been. The room was still churning, voices beginning to rise, questions passing between strangers. 2 of Victoria's friends moving toward her, and then stopping, unsure of what comfort looked like in a situation like this one. And then, from somewhere near the center of the room, a voice I didn't recognize said simply and clearly, "Someone needs to call the police." I kept my hands folded on the table. I kept my eyes on my son standing at the front of that room with the microphone loose in his hand, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has done a very hard thing and is only now beginning to feel the weight of having done it. "Ethan," I said quietly from my chair. He found me across the room. His eyes were bright and tired, and something else, something I hadn't seen in them in 19 months, maybe longer. He looked like himself. The room was still churning when Claire Hayes straightened her spine and spoke. Her voice came out clear and composed, the voice of a woman who had already made a very fast, very cold calculation about what the next 60 seconds required. "I want to be completely clear," Claire said, each word measured like a surgeon's cut. "Any financial arrangements you witnessed tonight were entirely Victoria's doing. I was a passive participant in a structure I did not fully understand. I had no knowledge of any forged documents." The room turned toward her. Then it turned toward Victoria. Victoria's head snapped up. She had been bent forward, one hand pressed over her mouth, tears running freely down her face. She stared at her mother with an expression I had never seen on a human being, before the expression of someone watching the last wall of their house fall outward and realizing there is nothing left to stand behind. "Mom." Her voice broke completely on that single syllable. "Mom, you cannot do this. You were there for every conversation. You told me to." "Victoria." Claire's voice did not waver by a fraction. "I think you need to stop talking. You told me to do this." Victoria's voice climbed to something raw and desperate, every trace of polish gone, every layer of performance stripped away, just the terrified core of a person who has finally understood she is standing entirely alone. "You and Dad sat at that table and laid out the timeline. You reviewed every document. You set up the LLC yourself. You cannot stand here and tell these people you didn't know. I am advising you," Claire said with the terrible calm of a woman who has already decided which version of events she intends to live inside, "to stop talking and call a lawyer." Victoria pressed both hands over her face, her shoulders heaving a sound, tearing out of her, that was neither a word nor a cry, but something desperate between the two. For a long moment, the entire room watched Claire Hayes look at her daughter falling apart and not move a single inch toward her. That told me everything 2 years of Sunday dinners had only suggested. Marcus Webb rose from his chair near the side wall. He was a large, unhurried man, and the room noticed him the way rooms notice something that has been still a long time and suddenly moves. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said steadily. "I'm a licensed private investigator retained by Harold Miller. 3 days ago, I delivered a complete evidentiary package, audio recordings, financial records, business filings, the forged power of attorney, and full forensic certifications to the FBI Houston field office." He paused, letting it settle like a stone through still water. "This is no longer a civil matter. What you witnessed tonight is evidence in an active federal investigation." The word federal moved through that room like a current. 2 women who had been stepping toward Victoria to offer comfort stopped mid-stride and looked at each other rapidly, reconsidering. Then Preston Hayes crossed the room toward me. He moved through the thinning crowd with the momentum of a man who had run out of targets and finally landed on the original one. His face was dark, his jaw locked, his eyes carrying the expression of someone who still believes volume and physical size are currencies worth spending. He stopped 4 feet away and looked down at me. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice low and tight. "To my daughter, to this family. This could have been handled privately." I stood up, not fast. Men my age don't stand fast. But I stood with the full weight of 68 years behind it. And that weight, I have learned, is something no tailored suit can match. I looked him straight in the eye and kept my voice quieter than anything else said in that room all evening, which meant everyone heard it. "I know exactly what I've done, Mr. Hayes. I protected what belongs to my family." I held his gaze without blinking. "You made choices. Your wife made choices. Your daughter made choices. And choices have consequences even for people accustomed to buying their way out of them." Something moved through his face then. Not rage, not strategy. Something older and raw, the look of a man who has finally run out of moves and knows it. He turned and walked toward the exit without another word. Claire followed, chin-level handbag over her arm, not once glancing at Victoria as she passed her. Victoria watched her parents leave. The sound that came from her quiet fractured the sound of someone finally understanding who the people around her had always truly been was the saddest thing I heard all evening. I sat back down. I thought about Sandra, about what she would have said watching all of this unfold from wherever she was now. Something dry, accurate, delivered with that slight lift of one eyebrow I had loved for 37 years. I almost smiled. After the Hayes family left, Ethan found me still at my table. The room had emptied down to a handful of people, his colleagues from the engineering firm, 2 friends who had planted themselves on the right side of the room from the beginning and stayed, and a caterer moving quietly around the edges of the space collecting glasses, with the professional discretion of someone who had learned long ago that the best thing you can do in other people's difficult moments is be invisible and useful. Ethan pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. His jacket was off his tie, loosened, and he looked like a man who had just finished running a very long race, exhausted in the bones, but breathing. "You hungry?" he said. I looked at the untouched food on the catering tables. Surprisingly, yes, so we ate. Ethan found 2 plates and loaded them up with whatever was left, and we sat in the kitchen of that River Oaks house, the house that had been the center of everything, and ate cold hors d'oeuvres at 11:30 at night, like 2 men who had earned the right to a strange meal. "Are you okay?" I asked him. Ethan chewed, considered the question seriously, and said, "Ask me again in about 6 months. "Fair enough," I said. He looked at me across the table, and his eyes were tired and clear in equal measure. "Dad, I need to say something, and I need you to just let me say it." "Go ahead." "I wasted almost 2 years," he said. 2 years of Sunday dinners and phone calls and you driving down here not knowing why everything felt wrong. And I knew. I knew something was happening, and I was too scared to—" His voice tightened. He pressed on through it. "I chose wrong. I chose to protect myself instead of coming to you, and that choice cost you things I can't give back. Time. Peace of mind. The feeling that your son still had your back." He met my eyes straight on. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm genuinely deeply sorry." My chest ached with something that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief, the particular feeling of a wound that is finally being cleaned. I reached across the table and put my hand over my son's. "You came back," I said. "That's what matters. You came back." He nodded, jaw working hard. His eyes went bright for a moment before he pulled them back under control. What followed over the next 2 months was quieter than the evening that preceded it, though no less consequential. Daniel Reeves coordinated with the FBI Houston field office, who had, as Marcus had promised, already been working from the evidentiary package for 3 days before the party. The federal investigation moved with the methodical efficiency of a system that had received everything it needed and simply required time to process it properly. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of a federal document. The charges were filed in December of 2024. Victoria's attorney negotiated a plea arrangement. She accepted 4 years in federal custody in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation into her father's role. Preston Hayes, identified in every document as the architect of the entire scheme from its inception in April of 2022, received 6 years. Claire Hayes, whose cooperation with prosecutors came faster and more thoroughly than anyone expected, including, I suspect, Victoria, received 2 years and a substantial financial penalty. The Galveston engineering report from 2019, the document Victoria had been using as a blade against Ethan for 7 months, was reviewed by the Texas Board of Professional Engineers as part of the investigation. Their finding, issued in January of 2025, was that the matter had been appropriately handled through proper channels at the time and presented no basis for current disciplinary action. Ethan's license was untouched. His reputation among the people who knew what had actually happened was considerably enhanced. He filed for divorce in November, the week after the party. Victoria did not contest it. There was nothing left to contest. In the spring of 2025, Ethan moved back to Conroe. Not as a retreat, he was clear about that, when he told me sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning in March, with coffee between us and the kind of easy quiet between 2 people that takes decades to build. "I've been auditioning for a life that wasn't actually mine," he said, "trying to fit into rooms that were always going to be the wrong shape." He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out the kitchen window at the property. "I want to work on something real, Dad. Something that matters. Something that stays." "You know the pecan orchard still needs work," I said. He grinned, the first real, uncomplicated grin I had seen on my son's face in 2 years. "I know. You've been complaining about those trees since I was 12. They deserve to be complained about, I said. He laughed, and I laughed, and the kitchen was full of something that had been missing from it for a long time. In April of 2025, Montgomery County officially published the finalized route for the highway expansion project. The corridor ran exactly where Sandra's friend Beverly had described it, 5 years earlier in the conversation Sandra had written down in her careful, small handwriting in a green notebook that sat at the bottom of a cardboard box for 3 years, waiting for me to be ready to open it. The land assessors put preliminary figures on the affected parcels. 45 acres in the Miller corridor came in at 9 times its pre-announcement value. 3 development companies contacted me within the first week. 2 sent representatives in person. 1 sent a letter on heavy cream paper with a figure printed on it that would have changed every practical circumstance of the rest of my life. I did not call any of them back. Some things don't have a number attached. Some things you hold because they are what you are, and selling them would be selling the record of everything that made you. My father bought that land with 15 years of wages because he believed in leaving something behind that told the truth about what a man had been. I intend to honor that. On a Saturday evening in May, Ethan and I were sitting on the back porch after a long day working the south field. The spring light was doing its best work across the property, turning everything gold in a way that felt almost deliberate. We had 2 glasses of iced tea, our boots were dirty, and neither of us had said much in the last 20 minutes because neither of us needed to. "Dad," Ethan said. "Yeah, she was right, you know. Sandra." He looked out at the land, and his face in the evening light was the face of the boy who used to follow me out here asking questions, grown into the man I had always hoped he would be. About all of it, I looked at 45 acres of Texas in the last of the spring light. I thought about a yellow cardigan, a green notebook, a line of capital letters that said, "Harold must not sell." "She usually was," I said. The mockingbird started up somewhere in the pecan trees, cycling through its borrowed songs, and the light held for a while longer before it let go the way good things do when they know they'll be back in the morning. I'm 68 years old, and I've worked this land with my bare hands since before Ethan could walk. I almost lost it not to a flood, not to debt, but to a smile and a forged signature. That truth still stings. Looking back, I stayed quiet too long. I swallowed my pride at that party, told myself the humiliation didn't matter, told myself a good father doesn't cause trouble. Don't be like me. If something feels wrong in your gut, speak up early. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It just gives the wrong people more time. I believe God doesn't put a man through fire to destroy him. He puts him through fire to show him what he's made of. When Ethan played that recording and the room went still, I felt Sandra's hand on my shoulder, though she's been gone for years. That was grace, pure and simple. "Here's what I know, now your name, your land, your dignity, those things are worth fighting for. No settlement offer, no polished lawyer, no wealthy family with the right zip code can take what God and honest labor built. These are the grandpa stories nobody warns you about, the ones that don't show up in fairy tales, but live quietly in real families. If this family story reminded you of someone you love, share it with them today. And if you've lived through a family story like mine or carry a grandpa stories moment you've never spoken aloud, drop a number below 1 if you stayed quiet too long, 2 if you fought back, 3 if you're still in the middle of it. Your comment means more than you know. Share this video, and if these grandpa stories move your heart, subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Thank you deeply for staying with me until the very end. It means everything. A gentle note. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that's not the content for you right now, no hard feelings. Step away and find what fits your heart best. But if you're staying, the next story is one you won't want to miss.